Hey, what's going on, you guys? My name is the Raptor, and if this video feels a little out of place, I can't really blame you. I don't tend to think of myself as a very controversial member of this community, mainly because I don't feel the need to share strong opinions like that unless it's relevant to the larger topic of the video. But don't get it wrong, I am still a very opinionated person, and at one point I realized that could make its own interesting topic for a video. So to change it up a bit, I'm going to share or reiterate my strongest opinions regarding some of the biggest talking points in this community all in one video, and if you're interested in that, hey, even better. Now, I know a number of people are gonna watch this and immediately comment, those opinions were not controversial, and I feel the need to specify the difference between controversial and unpopular. This is not a video going over my quote hot takes of the versus community. I'm simply going through topics I've seen a lot of people be on either side of and sharing my stances on them, so it's totally possible you could agree or disagree with everything I say here. Additionally, this isn't about sharing how I feel towards any majorly controversial matchups or episodes or characters as far as how they can be scaled, although some of that stuff might be interesting if enough people wanted to see it. This is just me giving out some general opinions on how I see versus debating as a whole and trying my best to explain why. This is going to be a chunkier one, so let's not waste any time and get to it. To start with death battles specifically, I am of the opinion that some characters or matchups simply shouldn't be on the show. And I feel like that statement in and of itself isn't that eyebrow raising, but let me explain how I feel this way. I mostly believe that more variety on Death Battle is a very good thing, but there is a specific group of characters or franchises that I don't think belongs here. My general criteria is that if a character is not combat oriented whatsoever, and the world they exist in is based off of our own world and its physics, there's probably no reason for them to be looked at in a versus context. If they have only one of those criteria, that's fine, but both of them, there's not really anything about them that implies a death battle production would be good with them in it. It's usually discussed just because some people like those characters and they like versus debating. But sometimes there are more appropriate ways to make comparisons between similar characters than in a fight to the death. Hell, put them in a rap battle if you really have to. Honestly, I think that statement can even work for matchups that don't have those problems, but are still kind of pointless from a versus perspective, but I won't focus too much on that. And yes, there are other things I think can limit a character's compatibility with Death Battle, like if they have an unkillability factor that's too overpowered or specific to be interesting, or if there's too much deliberate vagueness to their abilities or essence that you can't make sense of it all, or if the way they operate doesn't really allow for a literal fight. Some of that stuff can definitely extend to some analog horror, creepypastas, SCPs, or even more random characters, but it's also a lot more case by case to me, so I don't want to put a blanket statement over it. I think the main thing with stuff like that is Death Battle needs to do enough base level research to ensure a character or matchup works on the show before they actually greenlight it. If they can't do it in some kind of satisfying way, they just shouldn't do it at all. I still think this applies to the vast minority of characters though. Most of the time they're not unworkable, but it just feels like an obvious thing to me that if something's missing the elements to thrive in the death battle formula, we shouldn't force it just because we wish it could work. My next big opinion is more about matchup ideas in general. I think that connections and fight potential are ultimately more important than debatability. Those three elements are the trifecta of versus matchmaking, but it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone at this point that true debatability is much harder to come across than the other big factors, which are kind of needed for a matchup to make sense and be interesting to watch. Now, of course, this only applies to an extent. Like if two matchups for a character are close enough in the other areas, but one is way more debatable, I think that easily wins out. And some stomps are so uninteresting that it could kind of just ruin everything else. This is versus debating. Ideally, all matchups would be debatable. But once you realize that is far from the truth, it makes a lot more sense to sacrifice it in favor of much more connective tissue and production potential than the other way around. Unless maybe if we're treating it like a hypothetical and not a death battle video, but that's not really how I'm looking at things. Now, as far as what's the most important element, I firmly believe a decent level of both connections and good fight dynamic are absolutely necessary, usually. That being said, I think connections can sometimes be more easily replaced by something else, like legacy or contrast to varying extents. I actually really don't have a huge issue with legacy ideas like some people do, because to me that's just another qualifying factor for what could be one of the quote biggest versus matches. But whether or not you like it, that is something Death Battle could do. Conversely, you can't really replace how well the characters would fight in the animation with anything different, unless it's a bonus episode or something where realistically you could change it up a bit. But there's also a secret fourth thing that's important for Death Battle episodes, that being the popularity of the characters or idea. I think it's perfectly fine to like matchups that are less likely to happen, but we also need to recognize that just because you may want something that's unpopular really badly doesn't make it likely to happen. I'm sorry, but it's true. This next opinion flows in a similar vein, but being more specific to Death Battle itself. I think the analyses of an episode are just as important to its quality as the animation is. Not less important, not almost as important, literally 50-50. I know most people value animation much more, or will at least say that a bad animation will make them dislike an episode more than bad analyses would. And while I understand why that's a popular opinion, to me they are totally even in what makes a Death Battle what it is. It's a cool fight with loads of research, writing, and editing. And it's frustrating because a lot of people will also judge if they like an episode based on how much they liked the animation only, which means all the hard work outside of that gets massively overlooked sometimes. I think that's why some of my episode rankings have confused some people in the past, because to me the quality of the analyses will affect an episode's placement just as much as the fight, which I don't think is how most people do it. Unless you're unfamiliar with the combatants, in which case it might be hard to judge the analyses. I understand that. And while we're on the topic of me looking at Death Battle differently, the outcome of the episode making some kind of logical sense is much more important to me than the character I like more winning. If I like one opponent way more than the other and they win, but the reasoning is fundamentally flawed and overall can't convince me, I'm not going to be satisfied at all. Because we're not discussing who we like more, it's just about who would win in a fight, and I really don't think it's that hard to separate those two ideas. Now we're moving on to a few points that revolve around what should be included in versus debates, unfortunately starting with lore. Yes, I've talked about lore way too much this year, but I couldn't leave it out of a video like this, and some people still don't seem to get it. So one more time, here we go. My opinion is that lore is a valid part of a character and their world, just like scaling is, because by definition it's objective truths or backstory within the series that are literally told to us outright. At the end of the day, it's just another way of presenting the factual information to the audience, and yeah, that might not be the most satisfying way to do it since we don't see it happen, but versus debating is not about using what's most satisfying, it's about using what the characters are confirmed to be able to do, regardless of how we're told about it. No character deserves to win or lose based on what kind of scaling they have. I mean, it's not like any fandom would treat lore as fake material in any other context, so why should we do it for a versus context? I'm not saying that all in-universe statements or one-off quotes from a writer or creator should be accepted no questions asked, but if it's information that's realistically been reviewed and revised many times before being published into the media, then yeah, it's just part of it. Lore literally is the story. And first and foremost, it's always about displaying the characters as accurately as possible and being consistent with your versus rules, meaning you can't arbitrarily limit a character just to make the debate more fair, and lore usually isn't a case-by-case basis thing. Honestly, people who pick and choose who to use lore for based on other preferences bother me a lot more than those who don't use it at all. Like, at least be consistent. And yes, I know there are people that do that because so many of them were surprised that Death Battle was using lore for Doomslayer, despite Kratos vs. Asura just having come out, and then barely anyone was upset with Death Battle using databook material for Simone. You guys understand that's just another form of lore, right? Don't be mad at Kratos getting lore if you think this is okay. And this leads nicely into another thing Death Battle has done but has gotten some backlash for, using definitively non-canon sources as part of their analyses. I'm not really talking about how Death Battle tends to use non-canon material as supplementary evidence for characters' capabilities, but more so when something non-canon introduces a whole new idea. Stuff like Archie Sonic is its own completely separate canon, so naturally they're treated as their own characters, and you can find many other examples like that in fiction. Sometimes though it's a bit more confusing, such as when the world over heaven wasn't used for Dio because it originated in the non-canon Eyes of Heaven video game, but in that same game we're introduced to a weakness that Gold Experience Requiem possesses, and it was used in Joker vs. Giorno quite heavily. My controversial opinion is that stuff like this is actually completely fair and consistent within itself. Sticking with this example, the events that occur within that game are indeed non-canon to the main JoJo story, but it's essentially a branching timeline of it. The characters in that game are the exact same version, so to speak, of the canon characters, just experiencing different events, meaning the game is expanding on the canon powers, written by the JoJo's author no less. We've seen this pop up many times throughout Death Battle, including Akuma vs. Shao Kahn, where it's described as an example of what could happen in canon, making it very viable supporting material. The world over heaven was not used because that straight up was never acquired by Dio in canon, but a display of normal GER's powers or limitations in official material wouldn't be different from normal in any way. Ultimately, what I'm trying to say is I believe non-canon sources can be used in this way, provided that it has the necessary context to apply to canon abilities. Because it won't always work out that way, but remember, we're analyzing what we know the characters can do, not necessarily just what they did do in canon, as weird as that might be to say. Now, this next opinion is a little different in that it actually goes against how Death Battle has done things to some degree, and it revolves around how I define something to be non-standard material for a character. To me, standard material is anything that a character would usually have immediate access to in a random situation, or at most is something that's attributed to them and them alone. If this includes their own personal brand of disposable minions, that works for me. Let's face it, that's not outside help, because it's not help from the outside, it's help from the inside. But if it's something a character had briefly but lost, or something they had for a time and are known for but doesn't really belong to them, I usually don't think of that as fair game. And yes, that would include things like the Infinity Gauntlet for Thanos, or even the full life equation for Kyle Rayner. I've accepted that this is how Death Battle looks at a lot of things, and I get that they're just trying to avoid misrepresentation, but I think my actual hottest take for this video is, I don't think excluding things is the only way to misrepresent a character's power. While this is very rare, if their maximum potential heavily conflicts with the way they normally operate or are supposed to operate, I think we may need to consider reevaluating some priorities there. There might be some exceptions depending on the matchup though, like giving both Batman and Iron Man everything they've ever had, kinda like a prep time fight. Sure, why not? But as a rule of thumb for when that wouldn't apply, that's just how I feel about standard versus non-standard generally. And if there's one more take I feel like sharing today, it's one that I think we constantly need to remind ourselves of. Absolutely none of the stuff in this community is objective. And you've probably heard that sentence tossed around before, but I want to hammer home how true it is. As much as we might wish we could end debates once and for all, Death Battle is not objective. They're well researched, they analyze things in ways that make sense to them, but they can't 100% prove anything that can't be physically tested in the real world or confirmed in some kind of canon at least. But that also means that versus debating and scaling in and of themselves are very subjective, as proven by the many ways you could go about them. I'm not going to say there aren't objective elements to some scaling methods, or some aren't more reliable than others, but the scaling from character to character that you think is fair to use is subjective too. Whether you like it or not, we're all just saying what we personally believe. Thankfully, a lot of people seem to get all of this when it comes to Death Battle, but a problem arises when they don't hold themselves to the same standards, which unfortunately has kind of become the norm. Way too many people are so quick to say that a versus outcome, from Death Battle or not, is definitively right or wrong, and yet those same people will shout to the heavens that Death Battle can't possibly be the final verdict correct on anything. Like, if they can't be, why can you? You're allowed to agree or disagree with whatever you like, but to glorify your own opinions like that and pretend it can always overrule death battles is honestly just asinine. We can't be so quick to write off death battle's opinion just because it goes against the majority sometimes. What if they still have something valid to say? Again, that's up for you to decide, but it will ultimately just be their interpretation versus your interpretation. If death battle can't have the right answers, then neither can you. We really just need to go into death battles and versus debating with an open mind to having our opinions changed, because if we don't, there's no point in watching the analyses or arguing at all in the first place. The literal difference between opinions and facts is that opinions can rationally be argued for or against. So we have to accept the idea of new perspectives in a community that's all about arguing. This is why I'm so repulsed by echo chambers, because it literally defeats the whole point. Too many people just take this stuff way too seriously. Stop with this correct opinion or bad opinion shit, because as I've said before, opinions are made to be different. As passionate as I've been in this video, these have all just been my opinions too, nothing more, nothing less. There will always be a majority and a minority with this stuff, but that does not mean there's a right and wrong, only what you agree or disagree with. All of this is made up. Please remember that. And I think that's pretty well gonna do it for today. Thank you all so much for watching this long-ass, frankly random video. I know it got pretty ranty at some points, but I hope you enjoyed it, and at least understand my opinions, even if you disagree. Feel free to share any of your own that you feel like sharing, like and subscribe if you want to see more content from me, but other than that, I hope you have a great day, and that I'll see you again soon. Peace out.